You feel it sometimes. That strange moment when you realize you're being watched. Not by someone else, by yourself. You're in the middle of something completely ordinary, eating, working, scrolling, and suddenly you become aware that you're aware. It's like your consciousness just doubled, like there's a you doing the thing and another you watching the first you do it. Most people call this mind wandering and move on. But what if I told you that moment you just felt is one of the most powerful psychological phenomena still happening inside you right now? What if that split-second awareness is literally rewiring how reality presents itself to you? Welcome to the observer effect, but not the quantum version you think you know. This is the psychological version, the one happening inside your mind right now, the one that's changing everything about how you perceive reality, make decisions, and experience yourself. Here's what's actually happening, right now, at this very moment. Your mind is doing something most people never notice. You're not just experiencing life, you're watching yourself experience life. You're simultaneously living and observing. And the moment you activate this observation, the moment you become aware that you're aware, something shifts. Something real happens. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Let me explain what's happening in your brain right now. When you shift into observation mode, your anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal cortex activate. These regions are responsible for self-monitoring, error detection, and executive control. Your brain is literally creating a second layer of consciousness that's watching the first layer. This is what metacognition means, thinking about your thinking. When you observe yourself observing, you've just activated a two-layer system. And here's what's revolutionary. The moment you activate it, your behavior changes. Instantly. Not because you consciously decide to behave differently, but because your nervous system has detected that it's being observed. Even if the observer is just your own consciousness, your brain doesn't distinguish between being watched by someone else and being watched by yourself. Both activate the same threat detection and performance optimization systems. Your amygdala becomes more sensitive, your heart rate increases, your thinking becomes more deliberate, you're in performance mode. You've probably experienced this. You're having a conversation, completely natural and flowing. Then someone says, "You're being quiet today," and suddenly you can't talk naturally anymore. Your speech becomes stilted. You monitor every word. Why? Because you've just activated your self-observation mechanism. Your observer just became conscious of itself, and the entire system shut down. Now, let's talk about what this actually does to your psychology. When you're under observation, especially your own, your brain enters what's called monitoring mode. Everything you do becomes deliberate, conscious, and here's the strange part that messes people up. The moment something becomes conscious, it stops being automatic. Think about learning to drive. At first, driving is fully conscious. You're obsessively aware. Steering wheel, pedals, mirrors, everything requires attention. Your entire brain is focused on the task. But after months, something shifts. Driving becomes automatic. Your consciousness steps back. It stops observing. Your brain has automated the process. And suddenly you can drive while daydreaming, listening to podcasts, having full conversations. The observer moved away and the system became efficient again. This is the learning progression every skill follows. Conscious incompetence, then conscious competence, then unconscious competence. When you're learning, you need the observer actively monitoring. It's helping you detect errors and make adjustments. But as the skill becomes embedded, you need the observer to step back. The moment you try to consciously think about a skill you've mastered, performance drops. This is why coaches tell athletes not to think about what they're doing. The thinking, the observation, interferes with performance. This is why athletes talk about being in the zone. They're describing a state where the observer is temporarily offline. The consciousness that watches and judges has stepped back. performance becomes pure, automatic, extraordinary. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. You don't just observe your behavior, you observe your observation. You watch yourself watching yourself. This is the real power and the real trap of human consciousness. Think about what this means. There's the action happening. You're speaking, you're working, you're moving. That's level 1. Then there's the observer watching that action. Your brain monitoring your own behavior. That's level 2. But then there's the observer of the observer. Your awareness of your awareness. That's level 3. And you can keep going. You can observe that you're observing, that you're observing. This recursive loop is uniquely human. Most animals don't have it. A dog doesn't watch itself, but you do. Your consciousness can fold back on itself infinitely. This is both your greatest cognitive gift and the source of much of your psychological suffering. Here's why. Every time a new layer of observation activates, you're adding more processing, more judgment, more interpretation. At a certain point, this becomes exhausting. Your cognitive resources get depleted. You freeze up. Performance plummets. This is what happens when you overthink something. Your brain has 2 systems. System 1 is fast, automatic, and intuitive. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and conscious. When your observer activates, it switches you from System 1 to System 2. This is useful if you're trying to learn something new, but it's catastrophic if you're trying to execute something you've already mastered. This explains why thinking about your golf swing makes it worse, why overanalyzing a conversation makes you anxious, why monitoring your breathing makes it harder to breathe normally. The observer is interfering with the system. You're adding too many layers of consciousness on top of what should be automatic. But what happens when the observer never steps back? What happens when you become chronically self-aware? This is where psychology gets dark. Psychologists call this rumination. It's when your self-observation mechanism gets stuck in an endless loop. You observe your thoughts, you judge your thoughts, you observe your judgment of your thoughts, you judge your judgment. It spirals endlessly. And this is the critical thing. When you're anxious, your observer is hyperactive. It's constantly watching, constantly judging, constantly finding problems. Research shows anxious people have self-monitoring systems running at double speed compared to non-anxious people. The more they observe themselves being anxious, the more anxious they become. It's a feedback loop that feeds itself. Their observer can't stop watching, so the anxiety can't stop being observed, so the anxiety intensifies. This is clinical. This is measurable. This is happening to millions of people right now. Here's the neurological mechanism. Anxiety activates your threat detection system. Your amygdala fires up. Your body prepares for danger. But when you become aware that you're anxious, when your observer turns to watch the anxiety, a second layer of threat activation occurs. You're now not just anxious about the original threat. You're anxious about being anxious. Your observer watches yourself being scared, interprets that as danger, and amplifies the fear response. The observer was supposed to help you. Instead, it's making everything worse, because it's observing threat in a feedback loop. Each observation confirms the threat. Each confirmation increases the observation. The system spirals. This is why people with panic disorder sometimes describe their panic attacks as getting worse because they're afraid of having a panic attack. The observer watches the anxiety, judges it as dangerous, and that judgment triggers more anxiety. It's a purely psychological amplification. The original threat doesn't need to get worse. The observer's judgment of the anxiety is enough to intensify it. But here's what's revolutionary. The same observation that created the problem can also solve it, because the observer effect works both ways. If you can consciously direct your observation, if you can choose what you observe about yourself, you can literally rewire your psychology. This is the basis of every major psychotherapy approach. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches you to observe your thoughts differently. Mindfulness teaches you to observe without judgment. Acceptance and commitment therapy teaches you to observe thoughts while accepting them. They all work through one mechanism: changing what the observer is observing and how it observes it. When a therapist teaches you to observe your thoughts without judgment, they're doing something specific. They're training your observer to watch neutral, to notice without reacting. And the moment you do that, something shifts. The thought loses power. The anxiety loses grip. This is why meditation is so powerful. You're sitting in silence, and the only thing happening is your consciousness observing itself. But here's what's weird. The moment you really lean into it, the observer starts to dissolve. You stop being the one watching and the one being watched. They merge. And in that merging, something profound happens. Mystics have been describing this for thousands of years, but now we have the neuroscience to back it up. When your self-observation mechanism completely merges with what's being observed, your brain changes. The default mode network, the part that creates your sense of self, actually goes quiet. It's not that the self is destroyed. It's that the boundary between self and other dissolves. The distinction between observer and observed disappears. And people who reach this state consistently report the same thing: a sense of being part of something larger, a dissolution of the illusion of separation. They describe it as the most real experience of their lives. Why? Because they've stopped observing reality from inside their small, separate self. They've realized the observer itself is part of what's being observed. The boundary was always an illusion. But let's bring this back to your daily life. Because the observer effect isn't just some esoteric meditation concept, it's reshaping how you think, feel, and act every single day. Consider social media. Before social media, you existed relatively unobserved. You had private moments, your failures were private, your embarrassments were private. But social media changed that. Now everything can be observed, recorded, shared. And the moment you post something, you activate the observer effect. You know you're being watched. Comments might come, judgments might appear, likes or lack thereof. And the moment you activate that observation, your behavior changes. You become more conscious, more curated, more performative. Some studies suggest that social media has fundamentally rewired how young people experience themselves. They're always performing for an imagined observer. This is the observer effect digitized, and it's creating a generation of people who struggle to exist without observation. When they're alone, they don't know who they are because the observer isn't there. But here's something crucial to understand. You're not one person, you're many people, and which version shows up depends entirely on how you believe you're being observed and by whom. Think about it. You act differently around your parents than your friends, different around your boss than your partner, different when alone than in public. These aren't lies, they're not character flaws, they're the natural, automatic response to different observers watching. Each environment activates a different version of your system. But here's where it gets truly transformative. If observation changes behavior, and you are the observer of yourself, then you can literally choose who you become by choosing what you observe about yourself. This is called narrative rewriting in psychology. You observe yourself differently, tell yourself a different story, and your psychology literally reorganizes to match it. You're not faking it. You're not lying. You're using the observer effect to reorganize reality. A classic study demonstrated this. Researchers had one group tell themselves they were stressed before a presentation. Another group told themselves they were excited. Same physiology, same adrenaline, same racing heart. but the narrative changed everything. The excited group performed better, made fewer mistakes, had higher confidence. Why? Because the observer changed its story. It was no longer observing threat, it was observing opportunity, and the entire system reorganized. This is the hidden power of the observer effect. You can't always control your physiology. You can't always control external events, but you can control the story your observer tells about those things. And here's something even more mind-bending. The observer effect suggests that you're not a unified self observing a stable reality. You're a process, a constant reorganization. Every moment, you're observing yourself and reorganizing based on what you observe. This explains something that's confused psychologists for decades: the malleability of identity. Why can you change yourself, but it's so hard? Why can you be confident one day and insecure the next? Because identity isn't a fixed thing. It's an observation, and observations change. Your observer is always updating based on new evidence. If someone compliments you, your observer updates its story. If someone criticizes you, it updates again. You're literally reconstructing yourself moment to moment. This is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means you're not stuck. You can change. You can become a different version of yourself. Terrifying because it means there is no solid, unchanging you to find. There's just this constant observer, observing itself, telling stories, reorganizing. But let's move into something more practical, because understanding the observer effect has real applications for your life right now. In therapy, there's a technique called externalizing. You take your problem, say anxiety, and you observe it as if it's separate from you. You name it, you describe it differently. Instead of "I am anxious," you say, "Anxiety is telling me I should worry. Anxiety is whispering that something bad might happen." Suddenly, you're not your anxiety. You're the observer of anxiety. You're not anxious. Anxiety is something you're observing. This might sound like a language trick. It's not. It's a neurological shift. When you say "I am anxious," you're fused with the anxiety. Your identity and the anxiety are merged. The anxiety has taken over your entire system. But when you say "I'm observing anxiety," you've created separation. Now there's you, the awareness, the observer, and there's anxiety, something being observed. These are two different things. The anxiety is information your nervous system is generating, but it's not you. You're the one noticing it. This simple shift, observer stepping back from what's observed, is radically transformative, because the moment anxiety becomes something you're observing, it loses its grip. It becomes information instead of identity, a signal instead of a self-definition. The same applies to any mental state: depression, shame, self-doubt. If you can observe it instead of being it, you've already changed the dynamic. The observer is always more powerful than the observed, because the observer can choose where to look next. The observed can't move, but the observer can redirect attention. This is why mindfulness meditation is scientifically proven to reduce anxiety and depression. It's teaching your observer to observe without judgment, to notice the thought, acknowledge it, but not attach to it, to simply watch what arises without interpreting it as dangerous or taking it personally. When you meditate, the observer sees the thought arise, stays present with it, watches it dissolve. The entire time, the observer remains untouched, unchanged. The thought comes, the observer notices it, the thought goes, the observer is still there. This unchanging quality of awareness in the midst of changing experience is the foundation of deep peace. Because everything else is always changing. Your thoughts change, your feelings change, your circumstances change, your body changes, your relationships change, even your personality changes over time. But the awareness itself, the observer, never changes. It's always present, always witnessing. There's a part of you that's eternal, not in a religious way necessarily, but literally. The consciousness that witnessed your life at age 5 is the same consciousness witnessing your life now. It's seen all the changes. It's remained unchanged throughout. Think about what that means. Now, here's where most people break. When you become too self-aware, too much of an observer, something breaks. There's a condition called depersonalization. People with depersonalization describe feeling like they're watching their own life from outside their body. They're observing themselves live rather than actually living. They describe it as like watching a movie of yourself instead of being yourself, and it's incredibly distressing. Depersonalization happens when the observer becomes so dominant that the connection between observer and observed fractures. Instead of being integrated, observer and body working as one system, they split apart. You get this dissociation where you're permanently watching yourself from a distance. This is why constantly performing for external observation can be psychologically damaging. Your observer becomes so focused on how you appear to others that it loses connection to how you actually are. You become all facade, no substance, just constantly monitoring and judging. The solution is integration. You need to let the observer and the observed merge sometimes. You need moments where you're not watching yourself, where you're just being, where you surrender the observation. This is why flow states are so psychologically healthy. In flow, whether you're playing music, creating art, or doing anything you're deeply engaged with, the observer steps back. You stop watching yourself perform and just perform. The consciousness that was observing merges with the consciousness that was acting. And in flow, something remarkable happens. Your performance becomes extraordinary, not because you're trying hard, because you've stopped trying. The observer has surrendered. What happens neurologically during flow is simple. The part of your brain that does self-monitoring, the prefrontal cortex, goes quiet. You stop watching yourself. There's no observer between you and the action anymore. You're pure input and output, pure doing. This is the state athletes want to reach. Musicians, artists, anyone doing something where performance matters. Because the observer is both your greatest asset and your greatest liability. When it's on in the right way, you're focused and engaged. When it's on the wrong way, you're anxious and self-conscious. And when it's off entirely, you're in flow. So the observer effect isn't just a curious psychological phenomenon. It's the mechanism that determines your entire experience of being alive. It's what creates your personality, your performance, your potential, your suffering. Understanding this changes everything because it means you have a choice. The observer is not your master. You are the observer. And that means you can observe differently. You can choose to observe yourself with compassion instead of judgment. You can choose to observe your potential instead of your limitations. You can choose to observe your thoughts without becoming them. You can choose to observe your failures as data instead of identity. This is the revolution that happens when you understand the observer effect at a psychological level. You realize that reality, your reality, isn't something that happens to you. It's something you're constructing moment by moment through your observation. And the beautiful part, once you realize you're painting reality through observation, you can start painting consciously. This is what it means to take psychological responsibility for your life. Not in a toxic positivity way, not in a just think positive way, but in an actual, neurological, measurable way. Your observation creates your reality, so choose what you observe. When something goes wrong, you can observe it as failure or as feedback. The event is the same, but the observation determines what it becomes. If you observe it as failure, your nervous system activates the threat response. Your brain goes into defensive mode, possibilities narrow. But if you observe the same event as feedback, as information you need, your brain activates the curiosity response. You open up, you explore, you learn. Same event, different observation, different result. This is the practical application of the observer effect, and it's available to you right now. When you feel anxious, you can observe the anxiety instead of being the anxiety. I'm noticing anxiety. Not I am anxious. Tiny language shift. Massive psychological shift. Because now you're the observer watching anxiety arise and pass. When you make a mistake, you can observe it as your brain learning instead of as evidence that you're broken. My brain is processing this new pattern, not I'm such an idiot. Different observation, different neurology, different result. When you feel doubt, you can observe the doubt without joining it. Doubt is present right now. Not I doubt myself. You're the observer. Doubt is something being observed. They're not the same. This is the observer effect working for you instead of against you. This is psychology in real time. This is the mechanism that transforms suffering into wisdom. But here's the final thing you need to understand about the observer effect. The real reason it's changing you. Your consciousness is plastic. It's always reorganizing based on what it observes. And in this modern world, your consciousness is being shaped by observation in unprecedented ways. Social media is training your observer to be constantly external, always watching how you appear, always monitoring how others perceive you. Your internal observer becomes secondary. The external observer, the imagined gaze of hundreds or thousands of people, becomes primary. This is insidious because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels normal. Everyone's doing it. But what's actually happening is that control of your observation has been transferred from you to an external system. Your internal observer, the one that knows what's true about you, what matters to you, what you actually feel, gets quieted. It's still there, but it's background noise compared to the roar of external observation. This is why people who spend hours on social media often report feeling anxious, inadequate, and disconnected from themselves. It's not because social media is showing them bad news or because they're comparing themselves to others. Well, that's part of it. But fundamentally, it's because their observer has been hijacked. When you control your observation, you control your reality. You can choose to observe your strengths instead of your weaknesses. You can choose to observe growth instead of stagnation. You can choose to observe possibility instead of limitation. But when external forces control your observation, when they're directing what you look at and how you interpret it, they control your reality. This is how propaganda works. This is how advertising works. This is how social media algorithms work. They're not just showing you content. They're training your observer. They're teaching your brain what to pay attention to and how to interpret it. Recognizing this is the first step to freedom. Because once you see that your observation can be manipulated, you can start guarding it. You can become conscious about where your observer is pointing and why. But let's go deeper than just avoiding manipulation. Let's talk about actively choosing your observer. This is where real power emerges. If you consciously choose what you observe about yourself, you reclaim your power. You paint your reality. You become the author of your own story instead of a character in someone else's. Think about how you observe yourself across different domains. In your relationships, do you observe yourself as someone who listens and understands, or someone who messes things up? Do you observe yourself as capable of growth in your career, or stuck and limited? Do you observe yourself as creative and resourceful, or uninspired and blocked? These observations aren't facts. They're not objective truth. They're stories your observer is telling. And here's the revolutionary part. You can change the story. This isn't positive thinking. This isn't denying problems. This is simply choosing which truth you observe, because every situation contains multiple truths. The person who failed at something can observe, "I'm not good at this," or "I tried something new and learned what doesn't work." Same person, same failure. Two completely different observations. Two completely different futures. The first observation leads to avoidance and shame. The second leads to curiosity and growth. Same event, different observer, different life path. When you truly internalize this, when you realize that you have agency over what your observer observes, something shifts. You realize you're not trapped by your circumstances. You're not defined by your past failures. You're not limited by others' opinions, because all of those are stories your observer might tell, but they're not the only stories available. You can choose a different story, and when you do, your brain reorganizes to match it. This is what people mean when they talk about rewriting your story or changing your narrative. It's not about lying to yourself. It's about using the observer effect deliberately. It's about choosing to observe yourself differently and letting your neurology catch up to that new observation. Here's what becomes clear once you truly understand the observer effect. Consciousness is not a passive receiver of reality. It's an active creator of it. Reality isn't happening to you. Reality is being constructed by you through what you choose to observe and how you choose to interpret it. This doesn't mean the physical world isn't real. The laws of physics exist whether you observe them or not. But your psychological reality, your experience, your mood, your sense of self, your potential, your relationships, all of that is actively constructed through observation. Every moment, you're observing and creating simultaneously. This realization has profound implications for how you should live. It means you're more free than you've been taught. You're not trapped by your past. You're not defined by your circumstances. You're not limited by others' opinions. All of those are only true if you observe them as true, and you can observe differently. It means you have responsibility for your internal experience. You can't blame external circumstances for your anxiety, depression, or sense of inadequacy. Not because external circumstances don't matter, but because your observation of them matters more. Two people with identical circumstances can have completely different internal experiences based on what they observe. It means you should guard your attention carefully, because whatever you consistently observe, you become. If you observe yourself as a failure, you'll become someone who makes choices aligned with failure. If you observe yourself as capable, you'll become someone who takes risks and learns. Your observation is literally shaping your brain through neuroplasticity. It means relationships are more malleable than we think. The story you have about a relationship, about a person, about your role, about how it should work, is not fixed. It's based on observation, and observations can change. This doesn't mean toxic relationships should continue, but it means that many relationships that feel stuck could shift if the observation shifted. It means your potential is not predetermined. Your talents, your abilities, your intelligence, they're all influenced by what you observe about yourself. Fixed mindset is just a particular observation. Growth mindset is a different observation. Same person, different future depending on which observation dominates. It means that transformation is possible, real, fundamental transformation. Not through willpower or discipline alone, but through observation. You can literally rewire your brain by consistently choosing to observe yourself and your circumstances differently. And because your brain is plastic, it's always reorganizing, this transformation can happen relatively quickly if you're deliberate about it. Most importantly, understanding the observer effect means recognizing that you are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not your circumstances. You are the observer. You are the awareness. And awareness itself is always free. Even in the most difficult circumstances, there's always the possibility of choosing what you observe about them. And that freedom of observation is the gateway to freedom itself. The observer effect isn't just a psychological phenomenon to understand intellectually. It's a portal to agency, freedom, and authentic power. Because once you realize that observation creates reality, you realize that you, the observer, are the creator. You are the observer, and that means you have more power over your reality than you've ever been taught. The observer effect isn't something that happens to you. It's something you do, every moment, every day, every time you decide where to look. So the question isn't what the observer effect is doing to you. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Because once you see how observation shapes reality, you can't unsee it, and everything changes. Your relationships, your career, your mental health, your potential. Because you finally understand that the observer, that's you, and you get to choose what it sees. You know this now. The observer effect, how it works, how it's been shaping you, how you can consciously shape it. The question is, what comes next? You are the observer. Own it. Use it. Create with it.